Hello everyone, hope you're all doing well today. My name is Emily and today we are ranking the Star Wars films. I'm not going to be including the other non-linear stories like Rogue One or Solo. I am just going to be focusing on the 9 Skywalker Saga films. I have seen Rogue One, but I'm not considering it right now because I don't really trust my opinion of it. I just kind of thought it was okay, but also I just kind of saw it on the plane back to the States when I was just sort of exhausted, so I'm not sure if I can properly critique that film. And Solo, I fell asleep while watching, and that does not bode well usually for my enjoyment of the film while fully conscious. So we are just focusing on the 9 Skywalker Saga films. I don't make it a secret on this channel that I really love Star Wars. It was one of the first big fandoms that I was ever in. I grew up with the prequels and I was a huge fan of episode 1 when it first came out. I was about 7 or 8 at the time. But then the Lord of the Rings films came out and Harry Potter, and that kind of swept me up in a whole new different set of fandom, so I kind of gave Star Wars a break for a while. I was always a big fan of the films like the prequels and the original trilogy, but they weren't a centerpiece of my life until maybe in the past few years. And now that I'm really back into Star Wars, I feel like I've missed out on years of development in the fandom, books in the expanded universe, the Clone Wars show, which I have only just finished watching. And to be clear, this ranking is my opinion only. I have accepted by now that I will never completely agree with any person's Star Wars opinions. For a while, I was seeing article after article of other people's rankings of the Star Wars films, and they kept infuriating me, so I decided to just make one of my own. So let's get right to it. Here is my definitive ranking of the 9 Star Wars films. At number 9 is Episode 9, The Rise of Skywalker. This is a film where I think I enjoyed the spectacle of it when I was watching it in theaters, but immediately afterwards I realized how angry I was at everything that had happened in the film. This is a film where you can clearly see how the sequel trilogy is the result of conflicting directions. There are different directors, different writers, each one directly reneging on the previous person's visions. And overall, this film really just typifies everything I dislike about the sequel trilogy. And maybe I shouldn't be so negative about the sequel trilogy because I'm a prequels fan. I know what it's like for people to really hate on what I like. But as much as I've tried to be positive about it in the last few years, I really can't get behind this series of films. I have never been that interested in our main protagonist, Rey. I just find her so bland. In this film, her character arc is rendered flat just as she was acquiring some dimension in the previous film, and we'll get to the previous film. She ends up as she always was. She was alone, no found family, no nothing, and she is just as overpowered as always. And this ending really speaks to what I was talking about in my Little Women review, where it seems like in pop culture we feel the need to make strong women stay single. I've heard a lot of women talk about how they were triggered by Rey's ending because maybe they've dealt with infertility issues or relationship issues, and Rey seemed like she was offering some hope to them, but then she just kind of ends up alone, which just sends a bad message. We're not even promised her passing on everything that she's learned. And after everything she's gone through, dealing with loneliness and seeking out a family, she has no one with her. The promise of this character and everything that she was going through was that she was seeking her family, a place where she really belonged. And turns out all along, she just belonged nowhere. And that is just really depressing. And you know why they did it? It was also they could imitate the binary sunset scene. There is so much lazy writing in this film. There are no stakes. It likes to tease us that this character has died, but then they're actually not dead. C-3PO is going to have his memory erased, but look, there's a backup. The previous film started to challenge our notions of the Jedi and the Sith and whether we should have that binary between the two. But then this film goes back on that and sets up the Jedi as being this triumphant thing, which frankly they never were in all 9 films. We're just back to a plain simplistic triumph of good over evil. Rey is tempted by the dark side. Not that we had any fear for her or anything, because she's always been a perfect character throughout this whole film, thoughtful and powerful and kind. These films like to tell us that there's potential for darkness in her, but we don't see that in anything other than her so-called abilities. Well, we don't see any potential for evil in any of her actions throughout these films. So the payoff of her defeating Emperor Palpatine is really empty. And speaking of Emperor Palpatine, it was just really a terrible decision to bring him back. Bringing him back really just ruins Anakin's arc from the first 6 films. And of course in the novelizations, apparently they tried to fix it by saying, oh, this is actually a clone of Emperor Palpatine, so it hasn't actually ruined Anakin's arc. But then, no, that's not how this works. Anakin's arc and prophecy are only fulfilled when you eradicate Emperor Palpatine. That was the whole triumph of Anakin in Return of the Jedi. And when you bring Emperor Palpatine back, it just makes that whole arc really cheap and worthless. Like the other 2 films in this trilogy, this film just really doesn't respect the prequels. I think the act of disregarding the prequels was an act of sheer cowardice that was only made for financial gain. This film wants to have the Darth Vader, but not the Anakin Skywalker, which was the whole point of that character. Kylo Ren was probably the most interesting character in all of these films, the one with the most potential, but the plot ends up jerking him back and forth in these films, so we try for a redemption with him, but that also feels kind of hollow. He never even gets to address the legacy of his grandfather, you know, the thing that has defined his entire identity. Like, really, Hayden Christensen should have been brought back for this film, because otherwise, how else is Kylo Ren going to understand the truth of what Anakin Skywalker actually meant and what Darth Vader actually meant? Like, that Force Ghost thing at the end was such BS. You really should have had these people in the film, not this voice cameo thing. So Kylo was a wasted character. You know who else was wasted? Finn. Finn, the converted, redeemed stormtrooper. This is a character who is force sensitive, who adds some humanity to the stormtroopers, but are we going to use that in any of the story, let alone this film? No, we're not going to. So to conclude, this film frustrated me. It made me extremely angry. Let's move on. Number 8 is The Last Jedi. So I respect this film for having somewhat loftier goals than the other 2 films in this trilogy. Rian Johnson is clearly a very good director. I like a lot of the way this film is shot, a lot of the visuals of the film. I love the idea that they had in this film to break down the binary between the Sith and the Jedi, because I always saw this as the issue with the Jedi and the Sith in the previous films. They had set up this binary in the Force, like, oh, there's the dark side and the light side, when really the Force is just the Force. And the Jedi, because they were so fixated on being light and nothing else, they ended up being so detached and robotic and set apart from other people's issues. They ended up being part of a very flawed system that didn't help people, and those were the issues that essentially created Darth Vader. But the thing is, I fundamentally disagree with how this film went about with a lot of other things. Like, the handling of Luke is awful. It's like this heroic, optimistic character became this whiny, cynical old man who's just wants to be on his own and not deal with people, not even to help his sister. I mean, the Luke we knew would never cut off his family, would never try and kill his own nephew in his sleep. Like, the Luke of the original trilogy was unwilling to kill Darth Vader, even though Darth Vader had done so many unspeakable things, just because he was his father. So Luke has always put family first, so that's why it didn't make sense to so many people like me to see him this way. I was so surprised when I heard some very seasoned Star Wars fans be like, oh, that's perfectly reasonable for Luke to be like this because, you know, he was whiny at the start of the original trilogy and now he's a whiny character. So that's actually very consistent. But the thing is, Luke grew from being a whiny character and became something else. And so this version of Luke that we saw in this film is not consistent with the character that he became. Now, I could have accepted this if we got a sense of the progression between Return of the Jedi and Force Awakens. Like, if we had a good sense of his character's evolution between those two films and what happened to him, that I could have accepted. But this film does not give us a good sense of that progression, and the reason that they cook up for his cynicism is, it really doesn't make sense. Like, first of all, Luke would never try to kill his nephew, but then for Kylo going to the dark side be the one thing that throws him into decades and decades of misery, that is not the Luke that we know. So I fundamentally disagreed with how this film handled Luke. Now, people like to pretend that this film was the first film that had the idea that you could come from nothing and be powerful in the Force. People were saying, oh, it's so revolutionary that Rey has no special parentage. And that's totally false, because Anakin Skywalker was nobody when he started. I know there's a bunch of things in the comics where Palpatine might have done something to his mother's womb, but I'm not regarding any of that right now. Anakin Skywalker was a slave, was nobody, and would have stayed so if Qui-Gon had not found him. And you know what? I would have been okay either way if Rey had special parentage or if she had none. But the problem was, her entire thing in the previous film was her thing about her parents. That was her only character trait, was that she wanted so bad to be reunited with her family. So when you knock that off the table, we have nothing left to work with this character. I don't find her interesting anymore. And even if she did have special parentage, which she did end up having, I didn't really see the problem with that. Like, people were like, oh, well, we don't want the Skywalker dynasty here anymore. And I'm like, well, the show Vikings is all about the family of Ragnar Lothbrok. It doesn't mean that other Vikings are not cool. We are just focusing on the issues of this one family. So the fact that we focus so much on the Skywalkers doesn't mean that other Jedi aren't cool or other people cannot be powerful. It's just that we were focusing on this one family drama. That's what Star Wars is. It is a family drama. It is about the intergenerational issues of this family. And that's the big takeaway from these films, the cyclical nature of families. There was also that whole Finn and Rose storyline, which tried to impose some political commentary on the film, but I thought it was still kind of dumb and insignificant to the plot. If war profiteers are a real thing in this world, then doesn't that mean we have neither good guys nor bad guys? Aren't both the Resistance and the First Order both just kind of cut from the same cloth? That just kind of takes all the stakes out of the film, doesn't it? So yeah, I really liked some aspects of this film. It's just not as much as I was very frustrated by other ones. Number 7 is The Force Awakens. So I think I also liked the spectacle of this film when I was watching it in theaters, and I did think that the story had some potential. But as I think about it more and more, I realize how much it just wants to ape A New Hope in non-interesting ways. Like, it's so obvious how it wants to imitate all the dynamics and moments and plot points of A New Hope, but it really just doesn't achieve the same effect because the context of those moments were so special to A New Hope, and you need to do so much more work to give those moments the same kind of context that make them good. And I really just don't appreciate how we've gone back to a similar state of affairs as we were in A New Hope, with this big overarching fascist regime and this little resistance force. Like, if we wanted to see this again, we could just watch the original trilogy. It would have been so much more interesting if the First Order had been sort of this fringe movement that was giving the New Republic a hard time. But no, they wanted to imitate the original films, so they also needed to create the same dynamic, and therefore implying that no progress was made whatsoever between episode 6 and 7. And you already know my thoughts about Rey, and I just really don't agree with the treatment of Han either, because he's just in the same place as he was in A New Hope, just of doing illegal things and being a deadbeat and not having any responsibilities. Like Luke, he grew from being in that place over the course of the original trilogy, which means he was a different person. He was in a different place. So like with the state of the universe, he has just made no progress between 6 and 7. So overall, Force Awakens, it's an okay film. It set up some interesting potential and questions, which we know how that went in the succeeding films. But really, I just find it very bland. Number 6 is the Phantom Menace. Now, this was the first Star Wars film that I ever watched. So I won't deny that I have immense nostalgia about it. Now, I've said that I am a prequels fan. That does not mean I do not acknowledge all the flaws in the prequels, including this film. Like, there are very weird stilted dialogue moments, like that whole meeting between Queen Amidala and Boss Nass. That whole interaction is just, oh, that's not well written at all.
I ask you to help us. No, I beg you to help us.
Anakin is my favorite character in the entire Star Wars universe, but I do not enjoy him in this film. He is a Mary Sue. Yippee! Having grown up, I believe he should have definitely been at least a few years older, but you know, when I was a kid, I gravitated towards Anakin because he was also a kid. And overall, I think this film doesn't add a whole lot to the arc of the prequels. You definitely should not skip over this film, but it doesn't add that much movement to the overall plot. But still, this film is a lot of fun. I love how briefly the film becomes Ben-Hur, but in space. Some people like to criticize how much politics there is in the film, but actually I find that part really interesting. I think it adds a whole lot to the world building in this universe, which we didn't get a whole lot of in the original trilogy. And of course, we know world building was absent in the sequel trilogy. And despite the stilted dialogue, I don't understand why people were so repulsed by how people talked to each other, especially in the Senate context. Like, that formal way of talking to each other, isn't that how politicians talk? I liked how we got to see the Jedi Order and how they worked and how they used to be before the original trilogy and before their fall. Qui-Gon is a fantastic character, our first example of a truly rebellious Jedi who was really forward-thinking and just ahead of his other peers who were just so robotic and really detached from the rest of the universe. I've had conversations with people and they're like, well, why couldn't the Jedi just go and save Anakin and his mom and liberate all the other slaves? Like, somehow that decision doesn't make sense to them, and I'm like, well, it makes perfect sense because the Jedi were a bureaucracy by that time. They were part of that really flawed system. And then people are like, oh, well, that's just really not clear in these films. I really didn't get that out of the films. And I'm like, I don't really know what to say to that because that came across pretty clearly to me. Another weird criticism people have are that Queen Amidala and Padme have too many outfits, which, of all the criticisms you could have, and by the way, I love the costume design in this film. I had all of the paper dolls of Queen Amidala when I was younger, and I liked that she wears so many outfits because she's a queen, okay? I definitely think that if Anakin were older, Padme and Anakin could have had a more developed relationship from the start because they don't actually interact very much in this film. And I think we could have had some better groundwork going into the future films if we'd had that. And also I think with Anakin, the film could have done a lot more to convey his trauma of being a slave, because that experience ends up really messing with him later and contributes to a lot of his actions. His fear of losing control, that is all from him being a slave. So those are things that I would have done to improve this film, but still a really fun film. Let's move on. Number 5 is Attack of the Clones. This is an odd one, isn't it? So this film is commonly criticized for a lot of its bad dialogue, and I don't deny that George Lucas, not the best dialogue writer ever, but I think the real issue with this film is the connective tissue of different plot points. Like the Kaminoans' involvement with Palpatine's scheme, that ends up being kind of skimmed over. There's Count Dooku's role in the whole thing. There's also the reasoning behind the assassination attempts on Padme, which you can infer a lot about them, but it's not really spelled out very clearly. So I don't deny those issues, but you cannot deny that this film shows the immense visual creativity of George Lucas. Like, here's another thing that frustrates me about the sequel trilogy is that the planets are all so boring. It's like there's this grass planet and this desert planet. The design of the aliens is quite dull. But in this film, you get to see all kinds of aliens. You can really see that they thought about different types of peoples that would populate this world. Like, Kamino as a planet is so cool, like how it's all submerged underwater. And of course, we get to see other parts of Coruscant as well, like that diner that Obi-Wan goes to. I think Coruscant is so cool. It's a real shame that they didn't have it in the sequel trilogy. It's very Blade Runner. So Anakin and Padme's romance, like, yes, it's a bit clunky and they do sort of come together because of plot-related reasons, but I do really enjoy their moments together. Like, Hayden Christensen and Natalie Portman have such great chemistry with each other. And you do really have a sense that those characters are liberated when they are near each other. They can really tell each other their true thoughts, and they sort of relax and are themselves. Like, I don't like sand, that line, I think it's totally valid. Of course Anakin would hate sand. It's a reminder of his horrible past life. Like, their relationship is my favorite part of this film. It is the most wholesome and heartwarming part. And Hayden Christensen, the people pan his performance so much, but it actually makes so much sense when you think about how his character came to be. He was a slave, and he suffered a lot of trauma from that. And then he was thrust into this order of robotic wizard people. They indoctrinated him. They told him over and over again that his feelings weren't valid, that his attachments weren't valid. So yes, he's an awkward religious teenager, and I wouldn't expect one to act any different. And Hayden Christensen actually gets better as the film progresses. Like, maybe he just seems a bit stilted when the film starts, but then his monologue to Padme, it's a great acting moment. If anything, Natalie Portman does not get enough flack for her performances in these films. Like, when she responds to Anakin's confession about killing the Tusken Raiders, her reaction is just kind of weird and weirdly serene. I think the main issue with Anakin is that there is not enough continuity between his character in this film and his character in Phantom Menace. I've said this before, but in Phantom Menace, they don't really bring out his troubles as a kid. All we get to see in Phantom Menace is this happy-go-lucky child who's so optimistic and willing to help. He's got some friends, he's got tech to play with, and he's got his own room. And that contrasts quite a bit with the sulky, troubled teenage Anakin of this film. And if they had brought out his troubles as a child in Phantom Menace a bit more, I don't think we would have as much of a continuity issue. Because I don't justify Anakin's decision to massacre a whole colony of people who killed his mom, but I can kind of understand it from a character perspective because he's had all these attachments driven out of them even though he can't deny them, and then he's unable to save his mother when he promised that he would, and so then he hits a breaking point, he snaps, and I kind of understand that. Kind of like how I don't think the Joker's actions are justified in the new film, but I understand them. Next is number 4, which is A New Hope. Of course, this is a classic film, and of course it's the opening to the original trilogy, which is the most consistent in quality. This film, of course, is Luke's first evolution from this whiny teenager who just wants to get away from home into someone who actually has to deal with real-world problems. And also, this film is a great heist film. I love the dynamic of Han Solo and Luke and Leia. They all have something that they're good at, and I love that dynamic it creates. And it's also really fun to watch their plans come together because when Han and Luke come on board the Imperial starship, they don't really have much of a baked plan. They're kind of just making things up as they go, and I love how the dialogue kind of creates that feeling of everything being improvised.
A reactor leak here now. Give us a few minutes to lock it down. Large leak, very dangerous.
Who is this? What's your operating number?
But I do have to acknowledge that this film it is old, and that really comes across clearly in a lot of the effects and the action, and also sticks very strictly to the Campbellian hero's journey, so it makes the film super tropey. So great, perfectly fine film, an acknowledged classic, just not at the top of my list. Next up at number 3 is Return of the Jedi. What I love best about this film is not any of the action, but all the emotional payoffs from all of the characters. We see the culmination of the character arcs of everyone we've come to love in these films. We see Luke having really developed his abilities as a Jedi and also showing compassion towards his father in the true Jedi way. And we see Anakin Skywalker finally waking up inside of Darth Vader and eventually choosing his family over the Empire. Because really, every important decision that Anakin Skywalker ever makes in these films is in the name of family. So the starship battles around the second Death Star and that whole encounter on Endor, that stuff is great, but that last exchange between the Emperor and Vader and Luke, that's just beautiful. And number 2 is Empire Strikes Back. Are you shocked that it is not number 1? So critically, yes, this is the best film. I certainly like it best out of the original trilogy. I think I like films where I see heroes struggle. We get to see Luke in training in this film and having to learn from Yoda, who is awesome. And this is also one of the most spiritual of the 3 films. We get to see Luke going into that dark space and confronting that vision of Darth Vader, which is very shadow work to me. Like when he's doing that handstand and kind of in a trance state, that really looks like a trance to me, where he can kind of see things from different perspectives. It's very Hanged Man. I especially really love the way Yoda describes the Force to Luke when Luke is in this deep period of self-doubt. He describes the Force as being everywhere in the land and nature and in all peoples in the galaxy. I think he really beautifully describes the Force because the Jedi do believe that people are so much more than just their material selves living on the material plane. There is also a spiritual plane on which we all reside. And that's something that Luke has to kind of learn to break beyond his physical limitations. So that's a really beautiful spiritual aspect of this film. I mean, this film is critically acclaimed for a reason, but I think this is sort of an underrated aspect of the film. In general, I think the Star Wars films don't lean enough into this spiritual aspect of that universe. So I really appreciate it when I see this addressed in these films. And we get to see Luke fail, which is what a hero often does when he is inexperienced and impulsive and overly eager. And we have that great reveal that Darth Vader is his father, which is a great point of no return for Luke. And I love that after that reveal, he immediately accepts that Vader is his father, because I love moments when they clearly have this connection as father and son. Like they have this bond of blood that is deeper than anything else. And finally, at number 1 is Revenge of the Sith. It's funny that my 2 favorite Star Wars films are the ones where the bad guys win. This film is such a step up from the other 2 prequels. The acting is better, the CGI is better. People criticize these films for being overly CGI'd, but maybe I just don't have a very good eye, but this film is beautiful to me. There's that fantastic Anakin and Obi-Wan lightsaber battle at the end. A lot of people criticize the prequel lightsaber duels for being too flourishy and flowery, but I'm like, well, they are Jedi. They view lightsaber duels as being an art form as well as a means of combat. And Shadiversity has evaluated this battle blow by blow, and he has praised it for its technique, so it is empirically one of the best lightsaber duels. I think in this film we get to see the full range of Anakin Skywalker, from his best to his worst, from his most heroic to his most tyrannical. And I love his moments with Padme. I think they are so tender and wholesome, and places in the film for us to just take a breather. And those moments also make Anakin's fall so much more sad, because they talk so much about their dreams for the future, where they will raise their child and how they have hope for the future, when you know none of that is true. They will never be able to raise their child together. Padme will die and Anakin will be separated from his children until they are adults. And overall, this film is just so realistic about the way that bad guys win in real life. Bad guys win because we let them. I rewatched this film recently after finishing Clone Wars, and I think this time hurt a lot more, especially given what's going on in Hong Kong right now. Oh my god, Emily, why is everything about Hong Kong to you? Well, it turns out having your family's people be persecuted really helps you put a lot of things in perspective. Like, Hong Kong is a place where bad guys are winning right now, and that's because people are allowing them to, and that is precisely what happens in this film.
So this is how liberty dies. With thunderous applause.
People are blind to the machinations of a very powerful individual, and they just give him power. And that really hit a chord with me because we can witness that happening right now as we speak. So on that cheerful note, that is my definitive ranking of the 9 Star Wars films in the Skywalker saga. I probably made some people very angry, but you know, don't take it from me. I am but a simple YouTuber who disses Oscar-nominated films. Let me know down below your ranking of the Star Wars films if you are in this fandom. Subscribe to this channel, hit the bell icon, and like this video if you liked it. You can follow me on Twitter and Goodreads and Instagram, and I will see you in my next video.